Welcome to Religion, Royalty, Revolutionaries, and Realists Happiness Through the Era. We are your hosts, Michelle and Uma. This is a four-part series wherein we explore how the idea of happiness shifted across four eras of Indian history as reflected by their literature and media, and you are going to be taken along for this journey. We've divided our journey into four segments: religion for the classical period, royalty for the medieval period, revolutionaries for the colonial modern period, and realists for our present contemporary period.
So, the main question on our minds when we started this project was how does the economic and socio political state of the country affect the common people's idea of happiness? And how does their media reflect it? Without further ado, let us dive into segment 1.
It might seem crazy what I'm about to say.
Welcome to episode 1 Religion. Let me start off by asking a question. How did ancient thinkers define a life well lived? As duty, desire, or liberation? In this episode, we're going to discuss the religious era, which was the classical or the ancient era from 200 BCE to 1200 CE. This era lasted from the Maurya Empire to the Gupta Golden Age and later regional kingdoms. We witnessed flourishing trade, mathematics, astronomy, literature, Buddhism, Jainism, and Hindu philosophy. You know, Uma, long before the pursuit of happiness became a modern slogan, ancient civilizations were already obsessed with figuring out what happiness really means, not just for individuals, but for entire societies. Let's start with Ashoka, the famous Mauryan Empire from the 3rd century BCE. His philosophy, often called Ashoka's welfare ethic, was built on the idea that the king's duty was the happiness and welfare of all beings, or as he called it, Sarva Bhuta Hita. Ashoka's edicts could almost be seen as one of the earliest happiness manifestos. They promoted compassion, non-violence, and ethical living. Under his rule, the state didn't just focus on power or conquest. It took care of people and even animals. There were medical missions, herbal gardens, wells built along roads, and hospitals established across the empire. He laid out the principles of Dhamma, which is basically non-violence, tolerance of all faiths, obedience to parents, respect for teachers, generosity to friends, kindness towards servants, and goodwill towards everyone. In a way, it was a moral code designed to unify a diverse empire through shared ethical values. Now, in the Hindu tradition, happiness had a much deeper and more layered meaning. Classical texts didn't see happiness as a fleeting emotion. It was both right living and an inner enduring bliss, or what they called Ananda. Hindu philosophy organized life around four aims called the Purusharthas: Dharma, which is the ethical duty that you have; Artha, which is your material prosperity; Kama for pleasure; and Moksha for liberation. The idea was balance, pursuing wealth and pleasure responsibly, guided by Dharma, with the ultimate goal being Moksha, the liberation of the soul and union of Brahman. The poet Kalidas captured this beautifully in his play Shakuntala. Through his characters, he showed that by following virtue and living with faith in Dharma, happiness can be found in this life and eternal bliss beyond it. His famous line still resonates till this day. Today, well lived yesterday, a dream of happiness, and every tomorrow, a vision of hope. Then came Buddhism, which takes a slightly different turn. For the Buddha, happiness wasn't about pleasure at all. It was about freedom from dukh or suffering. True happiness came from ending craving and ignorance, leading to nirvana, a state of deep peace and liberation. The Buddha summed this up in the Four Noble Truths. Life involves suffering. Suffering has a cause, our attachments. It can end, and there's a path to the end, the eightfold path. Right view, right speech, right action, right livelihood, and so on. These are not abstract ideas, but practical steps towards inner peace. Then came along Jainism, offered a yet another perspective. It saw happiness as something that's already within yourself, the pure soul itself. But it's covered by layers of karma, imagined as a kind of subtle material dust. To uncover the soul's natural bliss, one must remove this dust through ethical living and ascetic discipline. The Jain path emphasizes ahimsa, which is non violence. It also emphasizes on truthfulness, non stealing, chastity, and non possessiveness. When all karma is cleared, the soul reaches Keval Janna, infinite knowledge and perfect happiness. And finally, Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest monotheistic faiths, tied happiness directly to truth. It taught that human well being depends on living according to asha, meaning truth, order, and righteousness. Its simple moral code, good thoughts, good words, good deeds, wasn't just personal advice, it was a formula for social harmony. True happiness, or ushta, radiated from people and communities that chose truth and constructive action over deceit and chaos. So, whether it was Ashoka's compassion, the Hindu quest for balance, the Buddha's freedom from suffering, the Jain ideal of purity, or the Zoroastrian path of truth, each of these ancient philosophies saw happiness not just as a pursuit of pleasure, but as a moral, spiritual, and deeply human journey.
Wow, Michelle, that was really interesting. It's so interesting to see how their idea of happiness was deeply internal, while ours seemed to be like, just gaining things from the outside. So I think it'll be quite fun to see how we went from that to where we are here as we go along.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I feel like, especially because in that time there weren't really many materialistic things, anyways, that existed. So they really were in touch with who they are as people themselves. Because right now in our age, we have so many distractions and so many materialistic things. So I really, like, you're so right about the contrast that we can see. And I agree, it's going to be so interesting to move forward through the eras.
Kind of makes you wonder, like, if what we would be like if we did not have these distractions, you and me.
Absolutely, absolutely.
It might seem crazy what I'm about to say.
This is episode 2, Royalty. When rulers are called the Zilli Ilahi, shadow of God on earth, does happiness depend on the throne? This episode explores the medieval period from 1200 AD to 1526 AD. This was the era of the Delhi Sultanate, marked by Indo-Islamic culture, Persian influence, Sufism, and Bhakti traditions. All of the political power was very much centered in Delhi, with multiple dynasties such as the Mamluks, Khiljis, Tughlaqs, and Lodhis. So, what this era basically meant, happiness is the same as a benevolent king. The ideal ruler was their direct pathway to happiness. Court inscriptions proclaim that where the king's justice reigns, prosperity and laughter fill the land. Firoz Shah Tughlaq's inscriptions at his Baoli, which is the stepwell, also emphasize this, and his welfare works, buildings, hospitals, mosques, waterworks were undertaken so that the people may live in comfort and happiness under my shadow. Baba Farid also wrote about the cold state of tyranny with the warm heart of a benevolent king whose protection brings hearts to bloom with joy. So, with all of this, medieval commoners naturally came to see happiness as a direct consequence of having the best king, one whose justice, charity, and divine sanction fostered communal well being. Many Hindu commoners even superficially embraced Islam during this era, only to get out of the rigid caste system. This shows how much Mughals they offered an alternate path to happiness for the lower caste people. Again, enforcing this idea of imperial happiness. But obviously, where there are royals, there will be some revolts. So all the people were not happy with this ideology, and this actually gave rise to the Bhakti and Sufi movements that we know a lot about. today, they were basically alternative routes to happiness if you were not very much happy with the imperial vision. And it was very much, it provided devotional access to ordinary people, which was previously only for the Brahmin caste. So Sufi poetry is an example of media that we have. It speaks of divine love, unity, and surrender as pathways to happiness, rather than material prosperity or imperial favor. So they offered the common people a structured path to happiness through union with God. Mir Khusrau wrote, "Poverty is more pleasant than majesty." Despite him being a poet who was bestowed with a lot of wealth from the royals. So this again emphasized that not everyone, even the people who had the royals' favor, they were not quite happy with this vision. So the transition from internal happiness to this imperial vision is quite interesting. So it's not like royalty was not there before when people were much more focused on internal happiness, but with the Mughals and the sheer size of their empire, I feel like people really experienced royalty and imperialism on a larger scale than before. So I think the emphasis on the opulence really attracted them. Imperialism was really more prevalent in the common people's lives, also reflected by all the poetry that we have from this era.
I think that's such an interesting, shift from how earlier I spoke about how they were all looking internally, and then suddenly there's this like humongous, gigantic influence of these the royalty in the Mughal Empire was it was so visible. I feel like that also, the fact that you mentioned how, people converted to Islam, and which was something so not native to our nation, and it was something so much so that it had come from outside, but because of the mammoth size of it, and I feel like the appeal to it was so much that people started considering converting, and people did that as well. I think that's an interesting shift to observe, and how influential the Mughals were. And also considering how that, I think that was probably the first time when people also decided to have an opposite opinion to what was already given to them. When you said there were the rise of the Sufi and the Bhakti movements, that's when people realized that, hey, I don't need to just listen to them. I'm probably not happy with what this is. I don't want to follow the herd mentality. So I think that also is such an interesting take. And I don't think that really happened in the previous era that we discussed, so much so as in the Mughal era.
The entire Delhi Sultanate seemed to be leading up to that. And I feel like this suddenness of the shift is also one reason for the resistance, right? Because it was so sudden. That's what led to all of these such powerful movements, because if it were a gradual shift, maybe we would not have had the Bhakti and Sufi movements, but because it was so sudden, people were like, wait a second, what's happening?
Yeah, so there were people who just went along with the flow, and then there were some people who resisted the change and took a step back and said, hey, let me look at this from an outwardly view, and this probably doesn't align with my ideals. So I think that's a great insight we've had.
One other thing I found interesting was, so the reason where people were converting to Islam, these were the lower caste people, because they felt so isolated from our idea of devotion, because that was something that was restricted to the upper caste.
Yeah.
So they wanted their own version, which is why they went into Islam. But then the Bhakti movements, the Sufi movements, they were all about connecting the ordinary people to, the idea of devotion. So I feel like this was one, where true branches were formed for the lower caste people to have access to that.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
It might seem crazy what I'm about to say.
This is episode 3, Revolutionaries. When the empire can't guarantee welfare, people begin to imagine a freedom as the route to happiness. Here we speak about the modern colonial period, from 1526 AD to 1947 AD, with the Mughal Empire flourishing, art, architecture, administration all around. But eventually there was a decline, and this allowed European powers to leading to the British rule from 1858 to 1947, and the Indian independence struggle. So this is again very interesting because we have two very contrasting themes in the same section, which is the peak of this empire and then the downfall and peak of this other empire all at once. So obviously there were a lot of varying ideas of happiness. There is not one singular idea that can be formed. So the Mughal period, there was again, as we discussed, a shift from individual happiness to happiness of the people or the happiness of the empire as a whole. So all of the art form that we see from this era, it just consists of scenes of the court. We see like the grandness of the empire. We see very much where the growth of this idea that happiness is an imperial vision. This is where this has peaked. But from the 19th century onwards, it all went downhill. The Mughals they transformed the concepts of happiness, and they solidified this idea of happiness as prosperity and benevolence for us. But not only this, they also helped us realize that cultural integration is a way better thing than cultural domination. Dara Shukr, the eldest son of Shah Jahan, he wrote the famous work Majma-ul-Bahrain, the mingling of two oceans. In it, he established connections between Islam and Hinduism and promoted their coexistence. This was an idea that had not been previously seen before, except Akbar, who actually was also a huge fan of their coexistence. It was a pretty controversial idea at the time, but this is something that we see with the Mughal Empire. The coexistence of Islam and Hinduism, I feel like, was pretty well established during this time. Before it, Islam was not a huge thing here, and after it, obviously, we all know what happened to that. But yeah, so this is cultural integration was a huge thing that they brought. Now, this imperial model of happiness, it could not last at all, as we realized, because it all depended on the ruler. Happiness as a benevolent king. What happens when the king is not so benevolent? And we met Aurangzeb, and he showed us just that. So now this quickly gave birth to the idea that sustainable happiness actually required political independence. And this would be further realized when the colonial rule peaked, and we realized that independence was actually the most important aspect of happiness. Now, people were exploited to such an extent under the colonial rule that we could no longer imagine happiness without political independence and dignity. Raja Rammohan Roy said, "A fulfilling life required liberation from irrational religious beliefs and corrupt practices." He actually promoted Western education and freedom of the press. He promoted scientific thought, rationalism, and he encouraged people to move away from idol worship and religious practices. Then there was Gandhi. He said capitalism and consumerism are bad. He promoted self-restraint for societal and individual good. His ideal happiness was a simple, self-sufficient life where individuals limited their wants and they lived in harmony, grounded in truth and in non-violence. Then there was more relevant literature, including the writings of politicians such as Nehru, who actually promoted large-scale industrialization as a solution to the general unhappiness related to poverty and inequality. Then there was literature by youth leaders such as Bhagat Singh, for whom happiness was total liberation from all forms of exploitation. He also believed that religion was also a form of oppression. But nationalism was not all that was there to happiness during this time. From the works of Rabindranath Tagore, we actually understand that happiness was also seen as a creative and spiritual kind of freedom. So this transition from asceticism to nationalism as happiness, we get a very interesting glimpse from this very famous novel, Anand Math by Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. Anand Math means the abbey or the monastery of bliss, which is a very kind of like an oxymoron in this case from what we have discussed so far. So in this, the spiritual concept of ascetic bliss, which was very internal and personal to the individual, it was intertwined with the emerging idea of nationalism. In the novel, people were shown sacrificing their personal happiness for the sake of freedom. Sannyasis or ascetics, whose only goal used to be nirvana or spiritual freedom, they became the torchbearers of nationalism, and then they sort of redefined their bliss as liberation from the British. So this novel could also be seen as like a call to arms of all people, that we know what your individual idea of happiness is, but let's keep all of that aside for a moment and let's focus on collective happiness for our nation. So, if we look at the common people and their everyday life under colonialism, folk songs, festivals, small communal joys were what brought people happiness during this time. Life celebrations, marriages, all of those were expressed through these songs. These songs were used to express frustration, they were used to express desire, all of that. And they were kind of like micro expressions of happiness in a very trying time. And rather than the ultimate goal for these people, these were more like survival strategies, I believe. And this is obviously something that is not new, but it was again seen at a much larger scale at this time. So for these common people, happiness was about finding these significant emotional and social outlets amidst their daily struggles.
This is so different from the previous two eras, especially how the idea of happiness completely pivoted from internal and religious stuff, and it just became all about freedom and political happiness because of the circumstances at that particular point of time. So it really shows how happiness is so circumstantial, and it really, really depends on all of these externalities, especially the fact that religion took kind of a backseat, and people started focusing on more of their own collective freedom, and also expressing those micro expressions of happiness through art and culture, just so that they could survive the period of the British rule, where actually religion was used to divide them. So this era truly cemented two important aspects for modern happiness, which is the political freedom of the people and cultural integration.
It might seem crazy what I'm about to say.
This is episode number 4, Realists. In an independent, globalizing India, what actually makes life worth living? In this episode, we're going to discuss the contemporary or the present period, which is basically from 1947 AD to now. In this era, India has finally become an independent democratic republic. Nation building, economic reforms, IT revolution, and emergence as a global power. India has it all. When India became independent in 1947, happiness wasn't just a feeling, it was a goal tied to survival, dignity, and the collective dream of building a new nation. In those early decades, happiness meant the practical achievement of a secure and dignified life. Having a job, food on the table, and the pride of helping the country stand on its own, for many, a government job was the ultimate mark of stability, and ration cards symbolized fairness and shared progress. The media echoed this optimism. Newspapers and All India Radio celebrated scientific achievements, and Nehru's vision of a modern India filled people with hope. Films of the time mirrored that spirit. Do Bhiga Zameen and Mother India portrayed hard work, sacrifice, and moral strength as the road to fulfillment. Raj Kapoor's charming heroes showed that even amid struggle, happiness could be found in honesty, duty, and togetherness. But by the 1970s and 1980s, the tone had kind of changed. Political unrest, the emergency, and economic stagnation created a new mood, one where happiness became about justice and survival. The media covered protests, corruptions, and poverty, and on screen, the Good Samaritan gave way to the angry young man. Our very own Amitabh Bachchan's iconic roles, which we know him for, in Zanjeer and Diwar, captured the frustration of the working class. Happiness now meant fighting back, defeating corruption, and restoring moral order. Parallel cinema looked inward. Films like Anand or Chupke Chupke focused on small joys, middle class resilience, and finding meaning in family and friendship. At the same time, mainstream Bollywood offered escape, colorful musicals, and family dramas promised that in the end, love and reunion would still conquer all. Think Mr. India, Karz, or Kayamat Se Kayamat Tak. Happiness as fantasy, as moral victory, wrapped in song and dance. Then came 1991, and with liberalization, everything shifted. Markets opened, satellite TV arrived, and a new middle class was born. Happiness now meant choice, success, and consumption. Owning your own flat, driving a car, wearing branded clothes, traveling abroad. Economic optimism and global exposure transformed what it meant to live well. Bollywood followed suit. Hum Aapke Hai Kaun and Dilwale Dulhania Le Jayenge showcased lavish weddings, foreign backdrops, and designer fashion, a glossy blend of Western aspiration and Indian tradition. Moving into the 2000s and beyond, the definition of happiness started to fragment, becoming more personal, more introspective. Bollywood and popular culture began reflecting a generation exploring individual choice, identity, and mental health. Films like Dil Chahta Hai and Zindagi Na Milegi Dobara celebrated friendship, travel, and self discovery. Characters questioned arranged marriages, rigid jobs, and family expectations. For the first time, happiness wasn't just about settling down, it was about figuring out yourself first. Female led stories like Queen showed women finding joy in independence. Dear Zindagi talked openly about therapy and emotional healing. Gully Boy turned artistic ambition into rebellion. Kapoor and Sons explored queer identity and family conflict. And Made in Heaven brought same sex love into mainstream conversation. At the same time, India's digital boom brought both opportunity and anxiety. Startup culture and social media promised empowerment but also fueled comparison and pressure. Happiness became performative. Curated selfies, lifestyle reels, and the race to appear content. Yet, beneath that, many people started prioritizing authenticity, self care, and mental wellness. Interestingly, this changing idea of happiness also entered public policy. India now participates in the UN's World Happiness Report, and some states like Madhya Pradesh have been experimented with official happiness departments inspired by Bhutan's gross national happiness model. Delhi's happiness curriculum in schools focuses on mindfulness and emotional literacy. Public discussions increasingly tie happiness to dignity, equality, and justice, highlighting that emotional well being can't exist without social fairness and environmental health. Movements for Dalit, Adivasi, LGBTQ, and women's rights all assert that dignity and inclusion are fundamental to collective happiness. Policies like the right to education and food security laws reflect an understanding that social justice and well being go hand in hand. But challenges persist. Economic inequality remains deep, rural India often lags behind, and environmental issues, pollution, climate stress, affect both health and happiness. Social media, while connecting us, also amplifies comparison and loneliness. In a sense, we're still negotiating what happiness really means in a fast changing India. Is it personal authenticity or collective dignity? And can we have both? If we zoom out, the story of happiness in India is a mirror of our nation's evolution. In the 1950s, it meant building together. In the 1970s, it meant surviving and demanding justice. In the 1990s, it meant success and consumer freedom. And today, it's all about authenticity, mental wellness, and equality. Across these 75 years, Bollywood and media have captured that emotional journey. The songs, the colors, the love stories, and the dreams. Spiritual fulfillment still matters for many, but the dominant conversation today blends the pragmatic, the aspirational, and the collective. Modern happiness in India is no longer just about smiling faces on screen. It's about building a life that feels secure, fair, expressive, and emotionally real.
Wow, I really love how we explored how Bollywood movies, the themes changed as the ideas evolved, because that was like the entire point of this project, right? And now that I think about it, we ourselves felt this shift in real time, where the movies went from just love stories to stories about self growth, focusing on just the protagonist and the removal of love interests, basically. That was a huge thing, I believe. It was also kind of fascinating how in segment one we started off with happiness as a very much internal individual thing. It slowly grew to become like imperial, then it became nationalist. Basically, from individual we went to collective, and now we are back again at individual, but in such a different way. And some people who still believe in that internal spiritual form of happiness, I think they would find this individual idea of happiness selfish, I think. And this is also a huge theme in media today. Everyone who chooses their internal individual happiness is seen as selfish. But I believe the evolution of happiness, it was a pretty natural thing, and it's a very, we landed on this idea pretty naturally. Like, this was the only course of action that we could have taken after all of these events. So yeah, do you believe it's selfish?
I I think what you're saying is absolutely right, and I do not think it is selfish at all, considering I am from this generation as well. So my idea of happiness also aligns with everyone else here. And I really like how you pointed out the contrast between how we started off as in segment one with individual happiness, and we're again back to individual happiness. But the difference is just that the individual happiness preached in the first era was preached by a particular group of people, and we just had to follow it internally. But the internal happiness that is coming in this generation is truly internally, because right now there are so many ideas of happiness over here. Every other day there is something or the other coming up, and people can relate to it and people can express themselves. So I think the internal happiness, I'm really glad that I'm living in this era right now. I feel like we're really privileged to be part of this generation, so I don't think it is selfish at all.
And I believe what you said about a certain group told you to follow this path and you did. I think that is the main difference, because there was no true like questioning happening, there was no discovery happening as such,
Absolutely.
because you knew what the goal was. But here there are a lot of questions and there are not a lot of answers, so we're all just kind of finding ourselves, figuring out what our happiness is.
Yeah.
And I believe that is very healthy critical thinking going on there.
Yeah, exactly. Like their internal happiness was that if we follow this, we follow ahimsa, we will attain nirvana. Right now, no one is thinking about attaining nirvana. They just want to figure out life as it comes. So that's why people are just introspecting a lot more, getting in touch with their feelings, and the fact that mental health is being talked about so openly is truly leading to people actually finding out what truly makes them happy.
And I believe the reason we are able to do this is because of all of the forms of happiness that came before us. That is why we were able to reach this conclusion. In segment one, we had not yet had all of these previous forms. They were not informed enough. They did not know what other choices there were. So they could not possibly have chosen what was best for them.
Absolutely.
But with all of these different ideas behind us in our history, we are able to figure out we are able to pick and choose what the best parts are, and we are able to make it our own. And I believe that is really important.
Absolutely. History has played a big hand in what we are today. And I truly believe that there is so much more to come. And I am really excited as to how we go forward with happiness through the next eras.
Definitely. Thank you so much for coming along on this journey with us.
We were your hosts, Michelle and Uma, signing off till next time.